In the months following the first major victories of the Axis, the war appeared deceptively simple. Germany had defeated Poland in weeks, crushed France in months, and reshaped Europe with stunning speed. To many observers, this momentum looked irreversible. Maps were redrawn faster than diplomats could respond, and the absence of immediate resistance reinforced the belief that control had been achieved. Yet momentum is not mastery. Speed can conceal fragility, especially when victories outpace preparation for what comes next. Beneath the surface, logistics strained, resources thinned, and coordination grew more complex. Early success created a dangerous illusion that the war could be managed, paced, even scheduled. Leaders began to believe that outcomes were still negotiable, that time remained a tool rather than a threat. This belief mattered because it shaped every subsequent decision. Instead of reassessing limits, the Axis doubled down on expansion. The faster they moved, the less margin they left themselves. What looked like confidence was often blindness, and blindness in war is rarely punished immediately. It waits quietly until the cost can no longer be avoided. Germany entered the Second World War, guided by a strategic culture shaped by speed. The concept of Blitzkrieg was not merely tactical, it was psychological. Rapid campaigns were meant to collapse enemy resistance before economic realities could assert themselves. Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France reinforced this belief. Each victory confirmed the assumption that modern war could be decided quickly. What this obscured was Germany's structural weakness. The German economy lacked sufficient oil reserves, relied heavily on imports, and struggled to convert peacetime industry into sustained wartime production. Short wars concealed these problems. Long wars would expose them mercilessly. Yet success made restraint politically impossible. Admitting limits after victory appeared unnecessary, even defeatist. German leadership increasingly interpreted caution as weakness and delay as danger. The myth of the short war became self-reinforcing. Plans assumed speed. Supply chains were built for campaigns, not endurance. Strategic depth was ignored. Germany was not unprepared for war. It was unprepared for duration. That distinction would define everything that followed, especially once the war expanded beyond the borders of Western Europe. Operation Barbarossa was conceived not as a campaign of attrition, but as a decisive blow. German planners believed the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of a rapid, multi-front invasion. The Red Army, they assumed, would disintegrate before winter, allowing Germany to seize territory, resources, and strategic dominance in the East. This assumption rested on ideology as much as intelligence. Soviet resilience was underestimated, industrial depth ignored, and geography treated as an inconvenience rather than an adversary. Initial advances seemed to confirm German confidence. Vast areas were overrun, millions of prisoners taken, and Soviet forces pushed back hundreds of kilometers. Yet speed created distance, and distance created vulnerability. Supply lines stretched thin, equipment wore down, fuel shortages emerged. The deeper German forces moved, the more the war changed character. It stopped being about maneuver and became about sustainment. Barbarossa was not reckless because it was ambitious. It was reckless because it assumed collapse instead of resistance. Once that assumption failed, there was no alternative plan. The gamble had already been made, and the stakes could no longer be lowered. The Eastern Front revealed a truth Germany had avoided confronting. Time itself could become an enemy. As months passed, The expected Soviet collapse failed to materialize. Instead, resistance hardened, production shifted eastward, and manpower reserves absorbed losses at a scale Germany could not match. Weather compounded strain, but climate was not the decisive factor. Logistics were. German forces lacked sufficient transport capacity, winter equipment, and replacement systems. What mattered most was not the cold, but the calendar. Each passing week favored the defender. The longer the war continued, the more Germany's structural weaknesses surfaced. Industrial output lagged behind Allied capacity, fuel shortages worsened, maintenance backlogs grew. Decisions made under the assumption of speed now constrained adaptation. Retreat was politically unthinkable. Reinforcement was economically unsustainable. Time stopped being a neutral dimension and became an active force shaping outcomes. German leadership responded not by recalibrating objectives, but by insisting on endurance. Victory was redefined as survival, and survival was framed as inevitability. This shift did not reverse decline, it concealed it. By the time reality asserted itself fully, the window for correction had already closed. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese leadership believed they had achieved their primary objective: time. The destruction inflicted on the U.S. Pacific Fleet was intended to delay American intervention long enough for Japan to secure a defensive perimeter across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Early operations reinforced this belief. Hong Kong fell, Singapore collapsed, and vast territories rich in oil and raw materials came under Japanese control. To many in Tokyo, the strategy appeared to be working. What was overlooked was the difference between territorial expansion and strategic sustainability. Japan's industrial base remained limited, its shipping vulnerable, and its capacity to replace losses constrained. Captured resources still had to be transported, refined, and defended. Meanwhile, the United States began mobilizing at a scale Japan could not counter. Japan had not removed its opponent, it had activated it. The belief that time had been purchased delayed hard choices. Defensive preparations continued, but the fundamental imbalance remained unaddressed. Japan was racing to fortify gains before an inevitable confrontation with a vastly superior industrial power. Time, once again, was misunderstood, not as a weapon, but as something that could be controlled. Both Germany and Japan misread the United States in the same way. They interpreted political division, delayed mobilization, and isolationist sentiment as weakness. They failed to recognize these traits as features of a system capable of rapid transformation once committed. American power was not constant. It was elastic. Before entering the war, the United States appeared slow, hesitant, and inward-looking. After commitment, those characteristics vanished. Industrial conversion occurred with extraordinary speed. Civilian factories shifted to military production. Shipyards multiplied output. Aircraft production expanded beyond any historical precedent. This transformation was not improvised. It was enabled by scale, resources, and organizational depth. Axis planners focused on American unpreparedness at the moment of attack, rather than American capacity over time. This was a critical error. War is not decided by initial readiness alone, but by the ability to learn, adapt, and replace. The United States excelled at all three. What the Axis saw as delay was preparation. What they saw as weakness was restraint. Once that restraint ended, the strategic balance shifted decisively. By the time this shift was fully understood, it could no longer be reversed. By 1942, the nature of the war had changed. It was no longer defined primarily by campaigns and offensives, but by systems. Battles still mattered, but they no longer determined outcomes in isolation. Production, logistics, and replacement became decisive. This transition favored the Allies disproportionately. The United States and the Soviet Union possessed the industrial depth and manpower reserves to absorb losses and continue fighting. Germany and Japan did not. Every ship sunk, every aircraft lost, carried unequal weight. For the Axis, losses accumulated permanently. For the Allies, they were temporary setbacks. This asymmetry transformed strategy. Victory was no longer about achieving decisive breakthroughs, but about sustaining pressure. The Axis found themselves fighting a war they had not planned for. Their doctrines emphasized speed and decision. The conflict now rewarded endurance and capacity. Attempts to regain initiative through bold operations increasingly failed to alter the strategic trajectory. The war had become a contest of production curves and attrition rates. Once that transition occurred, the outcome ceased to be contingent on individual decisions. It became structural, and structures, once set, are difficult to escape. As the war progressed, heroism and sacrifice remained constant on all sides, but they no longer shaped the strategic picture. What mattered was output. American factories produced aircraft, ships, tanks, and ammunition at volumes that redefined warfare. Soviet industry, relocated beyond reach, matched this scale through sheer mobilization. The Axis attempted to compensate through innovation, discipline, and operational skill. These efforts yielded impressive weapons and tactical successes, but they could not overcome numerical imbalance. Technological advances arrived too late and in insufficient quantities. Skilled units could not be replaced at the rate they were lost. The war had become mathematical. Courage did not change ratios. Skill did not alter production curves. Even successful operations failed to shift the underlying balance. This realization was slow and painful. Leaders continued to speak of turning points and decisive moments, even as data contradicted them. The gap widened month by month. The war was no longer being lost through mistakes alone, but through inevitability created by scale. When production dictates outcomes, strategy becomes constrained. At that point, survival depends not on winning, but on enduring as long as possible. As the strategic situation deteriorated, the language of leadership changed. Early promises of victory gave way to calls for sacrifice and endurance. Objectives were quietly revised. Territorial expansion was replaced by defensive consolidation. The goal was no longer to win decisively, but to delay defeat. This psychological shift marked a critical transition. Wars are often lost internally before they are lost on the battlefield. When leaders stop planning for victory and begin planning for survival, momentum reverses. The Axis powers reached this stage at different times, but the pattern was consistent. Decisions became reactive. Initiatives sought to postpone consequences rather than change them. Resources were allocated to hold ground rather than regain initiative. Public messaging emphasized inevitability and destiny, masking strategic exhaustion. This shift did not occur suddenly. It unfolded as options narrowed and denial persisted. By the time survival became the objective, the ability to influence outcomes had already diminished. The war continued, but its direction was fixed. From this point onward, time no longer offered opportunity. It only imposed cost. And cost, accumulating without relief, defines the end of wars long before surrender documents are signed. Attempts to correct course came late and under constraint. Germany pursued new weapons, reorganized command structures, and sought political fractures among its enemies. Japan fortified islands, restructured naval doctrine, and sought decisive engagements to regain initiative. These efforts reflected awareness, not reversal. Structural disadvantages could not be undone by late adaptation. Industrial output could not be multiplied overnight. Manpower losses could not be replaced. Strategic depth could not be created where none existed. Adjustments occurred within a shrinking space of possibility. Every change carried opportunity costs that further weakened already strained systems. The problem was not lack of intelligence, but lack of leverage. By the time the full implications of industrial imbalance were accepted, the means to counter it no longer existed. Late-stage adaptation often appears desperate in hindsight, but it is more accurately described as constrained rationality. Leaders acted within the limits remaining to them. Those limits were the result of earlier choices. War punishes delayed realism. Once a system commits beyond its capacity, correction becomes symbolic rather than effective. By then, the outcome has already been decided, even if the fighting continues. As defeat became increasingly difficult to deny, psychological strain intensified within Axis leadership. Decision-making narrowed, dissent diminished, and information was filtered to preserve morale and authority. This was not unique to one regime. It is a common feature of prolonged failure. Leaders isolated themselves from unwelcome assessments. Optimism was enforced. Reality was postponed. This psychological collapse did not occur in a single moment. It emerged gradually as contradictions accumulated and explanations grew less convincing. The gap between public rhetoric and private understanding widened. Command structures rigidified. Flexibility vanished. When leaders can no longer acknowledge limits, they cease to lead strategically. They manage decline instead. The war's end was not marked only by military defeat, but by the erosion of meaningful choice. Orders continued, but purpose faded. By this stage, outcomes were no longer shaped by planning, but by inertia. The system moved forward because it could not stop, not because it knew where it was going. Collapse, in this sense, was not dramatic. It was administrative, and by the time it became visible, it had already occurred internally. The Second World War offers more than historical detail. It reveals a pattern that extends beyond its time. Great powers do not fail solely through defeat. They fail through misjudgment of scale, time, and control. The Axis believed they could manage escalation, dictate pace, and shape outcomes through speed and audacity. They underestimated the capacity of their opponents and overestimated their own endurance. These errors were not irrational. They were grounded in early success and reinforced by incomplete information. That is what makes them dangerous. History rarely turns on madness. It turns on confidence that outlives reality. The war did not end when control was lost. It ended when leaders could no longer pretend it existed. This pattern has repeated in different forms, across decades and conflicts. It begins with momentum, shifts into overreach, and concludes with inevitability disguised as destiny. Understanding this does not prevent repetition, but it explains it. Moments before collapse often feel like moments of control. That illusion is history's most reliable warning, and it is the lesson that endures long after the war itself. What follows is not fate, it is consequence. This was the moments before.